Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are tuning in from, and to MERL Cafe. My name is John Akwete, and I am the coordinator for MERL Cafe here at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University, and I'll be your host for today. Though you are tuning in virtually, we would like to recognize that Western Michigan University is located on land historically occupied by Ijawa, Odawa, and Boduwami nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor this ancestral land of the Three Fire Confederacy and consider the sacred land of all indigenous people and their continuous presence, especially wherever you may be tuning in from. The Evaluation Cafe is a weekly series presented throughout the academic year that features guest speakers on a wide range of evaluation topics, as evident in all our presentations last semester, and has been taking place at the Evaluation Center since the early 1980s. Though this has traditionally been a small in-person gathering that has been recorded and shared online, continuously from last semester, this spring 2022 speaker series, while some may be hybrid, all events will be open to the public to join regardless of location. For our 10th event this semester, we are delighted to be joined by our distinguished guest, Linda Raftree. Linda is an independent consultant and the founder of MERL Tech. Before we get started, for those new to MERL Cafe, we typically have 30 to 40 minutes presentation or discussion followed by a 15 to 20 minute Q&A section. Like our previous event, our guest has requested participants submit their questions in the chat box at any time so that she can pause every few minutes to respond to those questions. So before we get started, I just want to give you, Linda, a quick minute to talk a little bit about background and kind of how you ended up where you are today as an independent consultant and the founder of MERL Tech. Then at the end, you can proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for being on today's event. I see some familiar names in the participant list, so it's good to have some friends on the call. So I'm Linda Raftree, and I started off as an anthropologist many years ago, and that translated pretty well into development work. And then from there, started thinking about new technologies and ICT for development in the development space. I worked with Plan International with youth for a long time. From there, kind of moved into ICT for D, as we say, thinking about the role of mostly mobile phones in the kinds of work that international development and humanitarian agencies do. And then from there, started thinking about the fact that all of these technologies are collecting data and how are monitoring and evaluation professionals using digital data in their work. And that led to a conference called MERL Tech, where we started trying to understand really how are these tools being used in our work, but also how are we evaluating the use of these tools within programs. And so we ran the conference for quite some time. I think the first conference was in 2014. We didn't do conferences during the COVID years. I guess we're still in the COVID years, unfortunately, but yeah, that's kind of how this really nice network of people working in this space has kind of coalesced around this topic. And we did some really interesting research that I'll tell you about today with some folks who are on the call. We had a contingency from the university that was involved in the research. And I'll tell you about those trends, and I'll tell you a little bit about kind of what's happened over the last couple of years with COVID coming in. So I'm going to summarize research we did called the State of the Field of MERL Tech, where we try to understand what's happened since 2014 up to 2019 with trends in how people were using or how evaluators monitoring evaluation, research and learning professionals were using these kinds of tools in their work and what some of the trends are. So yeah, we did this report, a set of 4 reports, trying to unpack that a little bit. And so I'm going to summarize those today in the presentation. So I think I will just get started if that's fine. Is that good? Yeah. All right. So yes, the trends in MERL Tech is what we're talking about today. the research that we did, we covered, we tried to understand what had happened over these 5 years. We felt like that was a good piece of time to really kind of go back and think about what we had learned. And so we really saw 3 waves of technology being used for monitoring and evaluation. The first was what I always think of as how are we using digital tools and technologies to do what MERL professionals have always done, which is collect data, analyze data, understand data. And so there's a lot of tools out there that you might have come across that that are, I guess, more traditional. So thinking about databases or thinking about collecting surveys, but doing it on a mobile phone, using satellite data. We've always probably used maps, but maybe now we're using satellite data as a more sophisticated way of doing mapping. And there's growing academic evidence base around how these technologies are being used for MERL. Zach, who's on the call, and maybe some others kind of led this part of this particular study that we did, looking at this part around traditional MERL. And then we saw a second wave coming in around 2017. We saw people were starting to think about how could we use big data for monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. Should we be thinking about it as part of our toolkit? Is it better for predicting things? Can it be used to look backwards? What kinds of data could we have access to in the types of places that we're working? Is this data inclusive? All those things. So big data really started to come in as a second wave. And there's been a lot of work that's been ongoing related to big data. So we also did a paper trying to understand what the challenges are for organizations thinking about the use of big data in their monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning work. And then the third wave was around the same time as we started seeing big data come into the conversation. And this is really looking at sort of cloud computing and thinking about sensors and the Internet of Things, data that's being generated through applications. It overlaps a little bit with big data, but slightly different tools. And here, we also have things like drones and blockchain. And so all of these kind of emerging approaches are out there. People are starting to try them and use them, but there's not a whole lot of evidence base around how they're being used. And one thing that we always think about in our space is, we're using all these tools, but we're not actually doing enough documentation and evidence building around our own use of these tools in our own work. And so that's what we're trying to remedy a little bit with some of the papers and studies that we're doing as MERL Tech. And I guess I should also explain, when I say MERL Tech, it's a little confusing because MERL Tech is what we kind of call the community of people who are working on technology and MERL. We also call the solutions and the things, we call them MERL Tech as well. And then sometimes we use MERL Tech as a conference name and sometimes as an organization. So basically it's kind of all those things together as kind of a community, a practice, a sector. So yeah. So these 3 waves, I'm going to tell you a little bit more. Here you can see who the authors were. This was the Western Michigan cohort here that worked on traditional MERL and key findings. If you want to hunt Zach Tilton down, he can tell you a lot more about this. But we found that there was actually documentation and evidence base around the use of some of these tools. For example, the use of GIS, quantitative data analysis, management information systems. And these are most often used for implementation and monitoring and data analytics. One thing that we realized, though, is that there's a lot of practitioner-focused documentation on the use of these different tools that never makes its way into the academic literature base, and that there's a lot of really interesting learning and practice happening out there with the use of these tools that people blog about or talk about in conferences, and that we could really look at this gray literature and learn a lot more about traditional MERL Tech and what the good practices are. Some of the things that we concluded, we used a four R's to think about them. In terms of resourcing, there's poor capacity and we're not always clear about data quality sometimes when using these tools. that some of the technologies are more trusted than others. And so it's important to build on those technologies and kind of continue to use those and build up that evidence base to understand which are the technologies that evaluators are trusting when they're doing their work. That the demand is quite high for these tools in most organizations, but not everyone is able to bring them into their own organizations, especially smaller organizations. And that there were a lot of concerns around data protection and the level of understanding of a lot of evaluators about how to protect data that they're collecting on quite vulnerable communities. So those were just the really high level findings around traditional MERL. The wave 2 is around big data. So we had these authors, and this was a study that we did quite a lot of key informant interviews and tried to understand from nonprofit and development organizations, how are they using big data in their work? And so we really found that there's a lot of barrier to adoption of big data in most NGOs or INGOs, because there's not really a strong case yet for most organizations in terms of investing in it. And it's a long-term high-cost investment. A lot of the case studies that have been shown around big data haven't been completely relevant for folks working in the humanitarian and the development space. And so it's really a concept that that isn't completely proven. There's a lot of doubt about it still, or lack of ability to start using big data. Organizations don't often have capacity to access big data. Maybe large organizations do, but a lot of smaller sort of middle level organizations just can't really access this type of data. We found that there's also a lack of trust in big data analytics sometimes. So the folks, we had one case where people talked about the fact that their frontline staff who were working in different countries didn't really trust the analysis coming through big data analytics, because they were kind of closer to the communities and kind of seeing the programs firsthand, and were feeling like big data analytics was happening, way out over here, and they weren't sure if it was even answering the questions that they had, and they didn't really trust the data. So things like that are going on with big data sometimes. And that there are a lot of public-private partnerships where private sector companies want to support with big data analytics and that sort of thing, but this is often driven by the interests of the private sector rather than the real needs that are happening within organizations. So that's just something to consider. Again, our kind of 4 R's analysis here: resourcing. It's quite skill intensive and high cost to introduce most types of big data analytics. So that's been a real barrier for organizations. As I mentioned, the use cases are often concentrated in health, agriculture, environment, and not always relevant to some of the other topics that we're working on in our space. But this is starting to change as we have more cases and more kind of experimentation with big data and documentation of it. There's, as I said, a challenge in terms of proving return on investment. And again, there are lots of questions around bias, privacy. Are these types of partnerships with the private sector, are we on equal footing as a nonprofit sector with the corporations, or are they kind of driving their agenda rather than us driving the agenda? So those are some of the findings with big data. In terms of emerging technology for MERL, this is where, again, we talked about things like the use of data that comes in from mobile apps, use of sensors, drones. We also were looking at new kinds of data storage. For example, is the blockchain, distributed ledger technologies, is that something that's useful for monitoring and evaluation professionals? There's a concept of cloud computing versus edge computing, and edge computing means that data processing happens not sort of in a centralized way, but it happens closer out to where the data is being collected. And is that something that could be useful for MERL? And then machine learning techniques and things like text analytics to help us go through these massive amounts of PDF files that we have, natural language processing, that sort of thing, are some of the things that we looked at in the emerging technology paper. Here, there's still some mistrust about whether it's worthwhile to invest in these technologies, and especially in organizations that have quite low resources. There's some relevance. It really depends on what you're trying to find out, what data you're looking for, and for what purposes. some of this tends to be more applicable than others. There seems like there's very high potential, but there's really not been enough exploration of some of these technologies or approaches yet. And again, as with everything, we still have some of these concerns with data privacy that we want to think about. I'm just seeing that there's some things in the chat. Okay. Yeah, nothing, no questions or anything yet. So I'll keep going. So this was emerging tech. And one of the conclusions or kind of messages in the reports that we did was really that as there's a push for greater innovation, we need to make sure that we're thinking about both potential, but also any negative effects that we have, barriers, reasons that people aren't adopting this type of new technology. Because sometimes in the evaluation space, we find that people aren't adopting new technologies for ethical reasons, or because they're not sure about the data quality, or for other really relevant barriers. It's not because people are slow or they're, they don't like technology or they're afraid of technology. It's often folks that have really thought a lot about this that are saying, wait a second, let's hold off and not put people at risk, or let's not, invest a lot in this thing that we don't know if it really works, yet. How are we evaluating? How are we studying? How are we developing an evidence base on which kinds of technologies are the most useful in different scenarios, in different contexts, before we, throw all of our weight behind different types of innovations? So those are some of the messages that we really try to push forward as a MERL Tech community, is really a very thoughtful, purposeful, inclusive way of using new technologies in our work that's not alienating, that's not leading to negative unintended consequences, and to really be thoughtful about how we use technologies. So this was research that we did published in 2020, but then right as we were publishing our State of the Field reports, our friend COVID descended upon us, and we realized pretty much everything that we had, kind of put together in this package of those 5 years was going to really radically shift, because everyone was having to do things remotely. There was a huge move towards digitization of everything, including remote monitoring and evaluation. But there were also other things that were happening that have started to really shape. I think they've always been there, but they really came to a head in 2020. So some of the things in terms of kind of the backdrop around MERL Tech, I mentioned COVID lockdowns. There was a lot of conversation about collecting sensitive data. There was kind of a big fiasco about the exposure notifications. Did people want to be, notified on their phones if they walked past someone who had, had tested positive for COVID? What were the privacy implications of the types of data that governments were collecting on their citizens? So lots of questions around COVID and sensitive data were happening. And we also had a huge kind of resurgence of discussions around colonialism and racism in aid and development, power dynamics and evaluation in data, in tech sectors. A lot of this was really sparked by the Black Lives Matter movements, by the the massive amounts of protests that were happening worldwide, but kind of sparked a lot of conversation across the sector, including MERL Tech sector. We also saw this kind of growing awareness around data brokers in the private sector having a real interest in harvesting data, and kind of lots of questions coming up around privacy and how's that data being used, and if there's data on my location because my phone is tracking my location, who gets to have that data? What can they use it for? Sometimes that data is, collected by the private sector and given to governments without any type of warrant. So those kinds of data questions started to come up a lot. And some of us in the MERL space started wondering, are we contributing to growing levels of surveillance and growing levels of privacy violations by the way that we're doing our monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning? And what do we think about that? And how do we want to question our own work in terms of contributing to kind of a surveillance mentality? We saw a lot of talk in the last few years around tech business models that are really aimed at making money and selling advertisement, and really not prioritizing the well-being, especially of children and young people. At the same time, we see that donors are questioning fraud and questioning, really wanting to kind of micromanage accountability. And so, if you're seeing cash transfer programming, for example, the donor wants to know all the way very down to the very specific end user. What are they getting? Are they getting 2 bags of rice? Can we use biometric data to make sure that there's no fraud happening? So really a push on the one side of questioning privacy, and then a push on the other side of wanting more and more and more data in order to prove transparency and accountability. So those things kind of come up against each other in the space of MERL. In some places, we've seen competition for data amongst larger agencies, and kind of a power play of agencies that can collect the most biometrics or can collect the most data and have the largest database of, for example, the largest database of refugees in the world. And what kind of power does that confer onto an agency when they've got massive amounts of data? What does that really mean, and how is that shaping the sector? Versus lower capacity organizations that might not be able to manage and handle those large quantities of data. Are they being then pushed out, despite the fact that we're talking about the importance of localization and decolonization? And then country governments, this is kind of a last point that I'll mention. Country governments really waking up that their own data, the data of their own citizens, actually has a lot of value, and maybe not wanting that data to always be sent out to people, working in other countries and kind of profiting from data that they feel is their own data of their own citizens. And so we had a lot of conversations around data sovereignty, meaning that in some countries are developing their data regulations to say that their citizens' data must be stored, analyzed, maintained, and kept in their own country, so that they can also have access to it, rather than always kind of sending it out to other countries. And so those are just, some of the things to be thinking about and to keep in mind when we're thinking about what's going on with MERL Tech, because all these different strands of, kind of context really impact how we think about the work that we do and the way that we use technologies. There's been greater attention, as I mentioned, to digitalization of development. Remote monitoring and evaluation was a huge thing that happened over the last couple of years because of COVID, because people couldn't travel. And when we say remote MERL, sometimes that meant doing things through digital tools, and sometimes that meant less travel by people, from the outside, and more reliance and more, sort of more seeing the importance, which I don't think the sector saw it enough, the real strong importance of local staff and people who know the context and people who can move around in the countries where they're working, and not always sending somebody from the outside to kind of oversee, which had been the kind of the habit. Again, this links in with some of the decolonization conversations. And then thinking about alternative data sources. For example, is there administrative data, meaning data that's being collected by the Ministry of Health, or data that's being collected in the course of doing programs that could be used rather than always going out and collecting new data? Are there open data sets that we could access? But then what's the quality of those administrative data sets or the open data sets? Lots of conversations around responsibilities, whether that's in innovation, whether it's in MERL, whether it's in data, lots of thinking around privacy and protection of data that we collect, both during our programmatic initiatives as well as during our MERL. There's been a lot of talk very recently about the way NGOs and humanitarian organizations are becoming a larger target for hackers, for state surveillance, for non-state surveillance. We saw some of the really tragic things happening in Afghanistan, for example, where folks who had worked with different agencies were being targeted through their data for repercussions post Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. And we're seeing, just sort of the way that data is part of the war effort right now, for example, in Ukraine. So there's just a lot of thinking again around security of the data that we collect, and could that data potentially lead to really severe harm if it gets into unexpected hands. again, thinking around the same types of risks with social media platforms and the ways that entire groups can be profiled through their data, through kind of the big data technologies, or through their use of social media, and what are the risks and harms that are happening there. So these things might not seem like they're totally related to monitoring and evaluation, but for me, they really are, because a lot of us are trying to think about how we can use these different forms of data, these different types of data in our work. And I just think it's really important that we think about the bigger picture and think about how are we doing it, again, in very ethical, very responsible, and very thoughtful ways. And pushing back in our organizations if maybe our organizations are trying to push us to do something that maybe isn't quite so ethical or could put people at risk. What's our, where's the support, or how can we kind of push back and ask the right questions? A few last things I just want to talk about, and then I'll open it up to questions and comments and all that. But a really interesting thing happened during COVID. And there was a really massive increase in the percentage of the population that can now access the internet. It doesn't necessarily mean they have 24/7 broadband in their homes, but I believe it was around 49 or 50% pre-COVID. And so there's been a huge jump in terms of who can access the internet now. And we really think that was spurred by the pandemic and the need to get online, the need to find information, the fact that so many services were online, including education. But that doesn't mean that everything is, everyone is online now, because we still know that, girls, women, people with a disability, the most vulnerable still might be left out of access to the internet. So that means if we're trying to use big data, our data sets are going to be quite biased unless we address that. We also know that folks can be left out because they don't have enough money to purchase data or devices, or maybe they don't have consistent electricity. So we really still see that a lot of the data that we're collecting is skewed towards the elite, unless we take very specific steps to make sure that we're not only capturing data from the most privileged. Some of the things we can do for that is, really learn about the population, understand how people communicate before we think about using new technologies and digital tools to capture data from them. Think about inclusion from the very beginning. Maybe it's great. Maybe you can capture 70% of the people through a digital tool, but what about the other 30%? What are the alternatives that you're using to make sure that they're not left out? When we're working remotely, it's really important to spend extra time building trust with people, because data quality can really be affected if people don't really know who you are, if you're trying to call them on the phone, or you're sending them a survey through a mobile phone and they don't know your organization. So there's a lot of practitioner input around this really important aspect of building trust, especially when you're working remotely. Triangulating your data is always important, but if there's no one, because of a pandemic, because of travel restrictions, if no one can actually see what's happening firsthand, and you're having to trust everything that comes in through, self-reporting or through digital, really thinking about how you can triangulate data to make sure that you've got a balanced version of what's going on. Another term that I came across when I was doing some research is convenience sampling. And in this context, we're really talking about, I've worked with some organizations or talked with them. They said, well, we were trying to do our evaluation in X country. We had to do it remotely because we couldn't go there. So our staff in country were trying to do digital data collection remotely. And so we only collected data in these 2 districts because those are the districts that have a good network. And so when you're in COVID times, that's great, but when you're having to use internet connectivity as kind of your first way of choosing who's going to be in your sample, obviously your sample is going to be skewed towards, who has internet access or who has mobile phone access, which is going to leave out a large group of people, and it might be the most vulnerable. So really thinking about that kind of elite capture and convenience sampling again. Checking for bias, I think we do that anyway, but sometimes if we're working with new data approaches, we might not be as well equipped if we're not well trained in that, on how to spot bias in algorithms or in big data approaches. So making sure we've got someone who can think about that. And then really hiring, making sure our teams themselves are diverse and representative of different viewpoints, and hopefully, if possible, of the population that we're working with. Data protection, I talked about quite a lot in the earlier part of the presentation, but again, sort of some of the trends here, as I mentioned, we're really, everything became much more digitally focused. More organizations were using digital services and doing digital MERL. But we've really focused on getting data and not protecting data. So part of the work that we try to do through MERL Tech and other networks that I'm part of is really pushing for helping organizations understand and evaluators understand better how to protect data, the importance of data minimization and those types of things. And then being careful when we're working with larger organizations or working with the private sector. If we don't have all of those skills and all those clear understandings of technology and digitization of MERL, to make sure we're not being taken advantage of. And a question has come up in some other groups that I'm a part of is, are, for example, private sector corporations targeting NGOs and offering to do data analytics for them, because then they'll have access to data on potential customers and consumers that they couldn't normally reach. And so what are the ethics of that? Is that okay with us? Is that not okay with us? Or at least knowing that that's a potential thing that's happening. So really thinking about, again, these ethical issues. And so what are some of the things we can do here? Making sure that we plan and budget for each stage of the data lifecycle. So that means we need to plan and budget for collecting data, but also for analyzing data, for storing data securely, making sure we have the skill sets and the budgets to do every stage of the data lifecycle, not just data collection, but making sure we've got the funding for analytics and for proper storage and potentially data destruction once we're done with the data. Having responsible data policies and procedures in your organization. And that's everything from making sure you're using safe passwords to making sure that not everyone has access to every data set, making sure you're not emailing around sensitive data on spreadsheets. Lots of things that we can do as individuals, but then our organizations also need to put some things in place to make sure we're collecting data properly and securely. Consent is something that most evaluators have thought quite a lot about, but it shifts and changes when you're working in the digital environment. And there are quite a lot of conversations that are happening around how do you do consent properly if you're doing a mobile phone survey and you only have this much space on a computer screen to explain and to obtain consent from someone. Is that really consent? Are you really informing people? And so there's a lot of ways that we can do better at consent. Data sharing agreements are also really critical. So if we're sharing data with other organizations, we need to have some sort of parameters by which we're sharing data, making sure that if we're sharing it with someone else, that we have consent to share the data with someone else. But also if we're sharing it onward, how is that data being secured and protected everywhere that it's being shared with? And do we know where our data is? So there's some things that we talk about in terms of data protection when we go digital. And then inconsistencies, there's just some sort of practical things that I found quite interesting in terms of collecting data through mobile phones. So one of the interesting things, if you're trying to work with big data, for example, or trying to collect data through apps, is that people in many contexts share phones. And so you might be, trying to run an analytics on people who are clicking on something, and you might think that it's one type of person because that's the person that the phone might be registered to, but it could be a whole family using the same phone. And so it just gives you really different types of data than if it's an individual, every individual, is seen to be having their own phone. If you're trying to do more qualitative data and you're trying to stay in touch with a cohort over time, being aware that people often switch out their SIM cards and you might lose contact with them. People might not be able to contact you because their devices are broken or lost. We've been in situations where we're working with young people and they've had to sell their phones because they didn't have enough income for other things, and they would sell their phones and then we wouldn't be able to contact them anymore. Young people switch their platforms. You might set some sort of a group up on one platform, and then maybe, that platform is not an interesting platform anymore, and they switch to another one. So they're moving from Facebook to Instagram to TikTok to WeChat to, to different types of platforms. And so being aware of kind of following your users to where they go, and figuring out how to adapt your monitoring evaluation if you are using platforms like that to understand your population. And then in behavior change is really difficult to measure, and to know if what someone says they're going to do online is actually what they're going to do offline. So that's another challenge that we've seen in terms of measuring behavior change. So here, and I think this is my last slide, and then I'll see if there's anything in the comments, but really, again, understanding how your population that you're trying to conduct monitoring and evaluation with, understanding how they use technology, how they use data, how much access they have to data, to devices, et cetera, really designing for that context. So you might have to do a little bit of pre-research and kind of design your MERL initiative after doing some research to really understand the context that you're designing for. And then testing your assumptions. I think we probably always test our surveys and that sort of thing, but making sure you're testing those again when you're using digital devices. It's actually a little bit easier on digital devices because it's quite easy to change them if the pilot tells you that you need to switch them up. Offering alternatives to folks that don't have digital devices and making sure that they're being included, incentivizing people to stay in touch with you, and then really making sure you're communicating if you're being donor funded, making sure you're communicating these types of challenges ahead of time so that they're not surprised if people switch platforms or if you've lost contact with people, like just trying to understand and explain these things ahead of time during your design phase. So yeah, for 2022, and John is part of this initiative, we're working on a scan of MERL Tech in Africa. In 7 African countries and contexts we're looking at, and kind of trying to understand wider trends across the continent, to understand, what is the context of MERL Tech, who are the different players, who's working on this. There's also, I believe, going forward, going to be a continual unpacking of kind of power issues and the need for change to happen within the evaluation space. There's at the American Evaluation Conference coming up, for example, there's a theme around decolonization, and there's been really strong movement within the AEA around questioning some of these power issues and power dynamics. You're thinking about big data. There's, again, being a big push towards this big data, but what about Indigenous approaches, Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous knowledge that might be very different from what evaluators are typically taught to look for. So thinking about that is something that I see coming up. And then really trying to understand, is the shift to remote going to continue? Is it going to be how we do things? Or are people going to, as soon as it's okay to travel again, get right back out there and go back to how we were doing things? There's pros and there's cons to remote. That will be interesting to see kind of how that plays out. So I'm curious, maybe what folks who are on this event, like, what are you seeing? Is this resonating with you? What are the things that we missed? I just kind of love to hear from folks. Yeah, and that's all for me here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's some few questions in the chat most.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see.
The first one is from our executive director, Laurie Wingate. She said, can you give a real world example of application of big data to MNU?
Mm-hmm. So there have been, again, satellite data is one example that people often give because it's kind of a massive amount of data. So there's some interesting work that's been done to try to understand poverty levels at a much smaller and more focalized level. So generally we think of, if we could look at a map of a country, we might say, okay, this district is poorer than this other district. There's been some interesting work that combines satellite data with mobile cell phone data and tries to understand to a much more minute level where those pockets of wealth and non-wealth are happening within district levels. So that's one use. I'm not sure if you would consider that evaluation or if you consider it kind of research that then can inform your program design and implementation. That's one really interesting one that I'm seeing. There's also quite a lot of social media analytics that get done, so you can try to kind of look across. You can scrape data off of social networks, but that public data, please don't scrape private data off of social networks, public data off of social networks, and you can do text analytics based on that. You can set up your qualitative and I guess more qualitative understandings there as well. So those are just two examples. Sensor data also can come in very large data sets if you're tracking through sensors, and that data is also can be considered big data. Yeah, these are just some examples. I mean, other people seem like they do have some other examples coming in here. Let's see, Michael Bamberger, who you might have heard of. He's done some good reports on the use of big data. He did one for Global Pulse, which is quite thick and quite detailed. So that's probably a good place to look for specific examples. And then there's a report that was done by UN Women as well that looks at the use of big data for evaluation. And they looked at specifically, I believe, at Pakistan and at Mexico, and tried to understand, could they use Twitter data or social media data to make any types of conclusions around, I believe that one was political situation. And so there's some really good findings in there about what works, what doesn't work, and what things to consider when you're thinking about some of these methods. Okay, so Brad is saying the potential of big data may be overblown. Yeah, I think that's exactly the conversation that's happening. So there, when we started MERL Tech in 2014, then we had a session, and it was really interesting for me because someone was saying, well, we're going to have so much data on everyone pretty soon that we won't even need to do evaluation because, we'll just know because of someone's mobile phone if they're happy with the services they're getting. And, that was kind of this thought process that we would not need to ask people anything. We would just know from all the big data that was coming in. And that was a little concerning because I feel like that could be really good for monitoring, but I'm not sure that it gets us to the kind of the whys and the so what questions that evaluators tend to think about. So again, I would point you to some of the work that Michael's done. Michael Bamberger has done, because he's really been thinking a lot more about how to find types of big data that can be integrated into the evaluation process. I don't do that much with big data myself, so I would really definitely point you out to that publication from Michael. Let's see, NJ, interested in using advanced technologies to improve M&E work. Smaller organizations are already starting to perform at least an essential evaluation, might find it challenging to adopt new technologies. How can MERL Tech benefit these smaller organizations, and what would you say to elicit their interest? Yeah, I think this is something that sort of this question is around, maybe larger, more well-resourced NGOs are going to have the staff capacity to invest in some of these digital systems, but much smaller NGOs won't. Probably won't have those capacities. And I think that some of the data collection tools could still be quite useful for smaller NGOs. Things like Survey CTO or Open Data Kit. It's really just kind of moving your paper processes to a digital process, which can, even though there might be a little bit of an investment up front, it can eventually help you to save costs and to improve your data quality if you're doing things digitally, because you don't have double digitization if you're doing a survey or something like that. So I think those are probably good starter kits for smaller NGOs, would be to think about how to potentially do some digital data collection through digital surveys, through these more low cost tools and software. That's kind of what I guess I would say. But if other people have thoughts and ideas, I don't mean to just sort of monopolize with my ideas here. I would love to hear from other people who've got ideas as well and experiences there. So feel free to, I guess, unmute and say your bit if you've got thoughts on that one. I see there's another question around survey response rates. When you collect data via mobile devices, does it happen in the background or do people have to actively participate? Yeah, so this is a good question. So I think of this sometimes as, voluntary data and then as sort of involuntary data. And so both of these things happen when you're using mobile data tools. So I can do a survey on a mobile device and I could ask for your consent and I can actively say, would you please fill this survey in? I'm going to send it to you. You can do it on your phone, et cetera, et cetera. So that's like a really active way of engaging someone in providing data about something and getting their active consent to participate. Some of the app data stuff that I mentioned is all the sort of back-end data. And it's some of the areas where I personally have quite a lot of concerns around privacy implications for some of these approaches, because people don't normally realize the amount of data that's being collected through applications. And just when you use the internet, when you're, you've got these, cookies that everybody knows about, pixels, things that get embedded into websites that you visit that then just track you and understand everything you're doing and where you're going and all that stuff. So, if you are using some of those kinds of data, it requires quite a lot more sophistication. Not a lot of NGOs are doing that at this point. Some groups that are working on behavior change do kind of delve into a lot of this web backend data and use it to kind of track users. What are they reading? What content are they looking at? What are they doing after they read an article? Are they clicking on something? So there's, kind of these two different ways. The second way, which is a little more stealth, doesn't for me always have the kinds of consent that I would like to see for data collection. In terms of engagement, though, I guess the first, when I talked about trust, if you are sending out something and asking people to participate voluntarily in a survey or something, you'll have the same types of engagement challenges that you would have if you were cold calling people for a political survey or anything like that. So that's where the trust element is really important. And there are some good practices. I'll try to remember to send some resources. Sorry, my cat is coming to say hello. So there are some good practices around that. For example, the way that you frame the questions, putting your demographic data at the end of the survey so people aren't having to fill out lots of really kind of boring questions at the beginning, sending it from a trusted organization, sometimes going to the community and having a community meeting first and letting people know that they're going to get something on their phone that we would ask them to fill out. So there are a bunch of different kind of community engagement methods that people have found make it more likely that someone will fill in a survey. But that's continued to be a challenge with mobile surveys, is getting people to fill them out if you're kind of cold sending them out.
Yeah. If you have any question, please feel free to unmute and respond.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
It's hard for me to articulate it, but I don't know, there just seems to be a very large power imbalance in terms of who controls all the data being collected. And it's been, I guess still is, a matter of large private organizations like social media companies, et cetera, taking control of people's personal data, and now with governments and their development agencies taking even more control. In fact, requiring these large private companies to turn over their data to the government. It just seems to be sort of like an elephant in the room, and they say they're doing this in the guise of privacy, but we've seen how private organizations, the companies that first got on this bandwagon, and taking control of people's personal data, abused it. And I don't know that there's any safeguards preventing this, further abuse. Governments now, doing the same, if not worse. So is there some sort of solution you see coming, maybe in terms of, this edge technology or something else, or that might safeguard the smaller NGOs and private individuals who don't have their own systems, don't have any power in this mix to protect people's concerns about sharing their data, first of all, which limits response rates. And then, even if you do trust the organization you're sharing with, wondering if that organization is even going to be able to keep your data for you from being, inadvertently placed under the control of other large organizations that we just don't really know for sure as their leadership changes, who can be trusted and who can't. Once data is released and controlled by some organizations, there's virtually no way to take it back, right? So how do we protect or maybe balance the forces of power as MERL Tech professionals, or is there anything we can do to try to balance that power and make it more possible that this doesn't turn into a catastrophe?
No, I mean, I hear you, because that's a lot of I work on MERL Tech, and then I also work quite a lot on data privacy and data protection, data security, and kind of helping organizations set in place their own policies. And one of the first things that I always recommend is it's a difficult call, because you're battling two things if you're trying to engage people. You want to go to the platforms where they are, or they're never going to, you're never going to reach them. So then people say, okay, well, so then we have to use WhatsApp, we have to use Facebook, we have to be on Instagram, we have to use LinkedIn. At the same time, we know that those companies are collecting massive amounts of data, and we have no control over what they do with our data. So then we say, okay, is it responsible to use these massive platforms to reach people? And if we say, okay, no, we're not going to use these massive platforms, then how do we reach people? Because people aren't using all of the small platforms. They're not on the alternative platforms. So it's a really tricky question. I don't have answers. I know that we don't have regulation in the US, for example, that safeguards our data in any way. I was just watching a really great segment by John Oliver that was just talking about data brokers and about sort of all the privacy fails in the US, and the fact that there hasn't been any capacity to sort of rein them in. The EU has done a much better job, and the EU is kind of shaping a lot of the global privacy regulations, because they were the first to come out and put regulations in place. And they're kind of forcing some of the US based companies to comply, at least for EU citizens. California's got its new privacy law that it put out. Sometimes you have industry lobby that reduces the impact of some of these laws, but I'm hoping that there might be a moment in the next few years where there could be some kind of agreement on privacy protections for at least folks that reside in the US, or companies that are collecting data that have headquarters in the US. That's the way the EU law is set up. It covers EU citizens, and it covers companies who have their headquarters in the EU. So if you have an office in the EU and you process data in the EU, you have to follow EU data laws, even if you're collecting data from folks outside of the EU. It would be great to have some type of legislation in the US that could be implemented, and that could be kind of kept out of the partisan fray of our country right now. So that's one thing. I'm guessing you might be also alluding to some of the blockchain or the distributed ledger technologies, which are an option. Sometimes I feel like there's still a lot of questions around how safe and how secure data is when it is on the blockchain. And I would probably, if you're following kind of the cryptocurrency debates, there have been a lot of crypto hacks and crypto thefts from these, providers of crypto services, I guess I would call them. So I feel like it's still an area that's quite in flux. Some of the things that I usually recommend to people is, this idea of data minimization. So first off, if you don't absolutely need data from someone, don't collect it, especially if it's sensitive data. If you do absolutely need to collect it, what's the minimum amount that you need? What's the shortest period of time that you have to keep it for? And when can you aggregate it or anonymize it or delete it from your system once it's, served its purpose? Putting those data sharing agreements in place so that at least if you are sharing data onward, you have a really clear contract in place with whoever you're sharing it with, so that there are restrictions on what they can do with it. It's a really tricky spot because, I fully agree with you that larger, more resource organizations and companies are amassing the data because they have the funds to say that they're keeping it safe, which they may or may not be. So yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, and it's really relevant to everything that we're talking about for MERL Tech, but also for just our own personal lives and the way things are going. Yeah, probably not a very satisfying answer. I wish I had the answers to that, but I don't. But I think it's a fascinating conversation. If you're interested in those kinds of topics, there's a really great listserv called the Responsible Data List. I think it's responsibledata.io. And so it's a listserv, and they're constantly, kind of talking about these issues around data privacy and data management with lots of relevance to the nonprofit and development and humanitarian sectors. So highly recommend joining that list and kind of being in the conversation there.
Could you maybe write that down in the chat, or just say it slowly one more time?
Sorry, I'll put it in the chat.
Responsible data what?
I think it's responsibledata.io.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for that answer. I think it sounded very realistic given the concerns, and yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and that's run by the Engine Room. So if you can't find the exact URL that I typed in there, you can Google Responsible Data and the Engine Room, because that's the group that manages that list. So.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thanks for joining today, for all your participation. Be sure to register for our next week cafe. We'll be joined by Dr. Melissa Dancy. She's currently the Principal Research Associate here at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University. She will be presenting on distancing, minimizing and welfare ignorance, how white men maintain inequity while believing they are working for change. I hope to see you all during those sections. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. It's raining here in Western Michigan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.